We are less than a week away from the scheduled close of the lockdown in India. And although the country has been completely on board the lockdown train, it's a very good opportunity for us to talk to Dr. V Anantha Nageswaran, whose insights and examination of the rationale and consequences of a lockdown and even possible steps to recovery from it would be valuable for us to hear. Dr. Nageswaran is an economist. He is Dean and Professor of Economics and Finance at the IFMR Graduate School of Business, Kriya University. And he also writes regularly for several publications on matters of economy, both local and global. Welcome, Dr. Nageswaran.
Thank you.
Sir, in your Mint column and even on your blog as well, you have sounded a bit skeptical of the lockdown as a feasible option for a country like India. Was your argument premised on potentially catastrophic economic consequences of the move or a lack of robust modeling on the epidemic spread?
First of all, I would like to clarify to your listeners that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not as a dean on leave from IFMR Graduate School of Business, Kriya University, or as a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Government of India. So I am just speaking in my personal
Right.
capacity. So your question is a good one, and first of all, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a economist slash investment strategist in my previous work experiences. So it is not so much only the question of economic consequences, but the decision itself, as you correctly put it in the second half of your question. We are still working with lots of incomplete information and data, and therefore, to fill in the information gaps only in one particular direction and goading or almost coercing governments into taking action in one particular direction, which has consequences, including lives and not just livelihoods, is something that I was concerned about. And I made these points well before India took its own lockdown decision. So my concerns weren't particularly with respect to India alone, but overall the direction in which governments were forced to opt for a particular course of action without a very full discussion of all the other alternatives, pros and cons, feasibility, etc.
Right, right. Now, 2 weeks into the lockdown and with more data emerging, do you see an opportunity to revisit your earlier views?
No, I actually, if anything, I might say that even data from other countries, for example, in New York, I just read that the number of hospital beds required, etc., have turned out to be far lower than the initial dire projections. And even in India, if you
Right,
look at the curve since the first death was reported on the 12th of March, it's been far flatter than in other countries. So, of course, you might argue that this is because of the lockdown decision taken. I can see that point of view because in these situations, it is very difficult to, I mean, not very difficult, impossible to create a counterfactual scenario and see how it would have panned out. So now that the decisions are being taken with respect to the lockdown, and there is no way of knowing in real time whether the alternative would have been better or worse. The only thing we can look
right,
for is effective mitigation steps taken in a timely manner.
right. And what has been your experience with Singapore, for instance, which already is supposed to have excellent healthcare, and they have also now gone into a full lockdown.
Yeah, it is still not a full lockdown. Sorry, I let you complete your question. Sorry.
So, in terms of that, it appears that now the countries are taking the lockdown direction, which is why your sort of skepticism is very important. What
No,
would you
first of all,
say about
yeah,
the
sorry.
current?
I'm sorry. I thought your question is complete. Please continue.
Right, right. That's what I was asking.
Okay. So, no, first of all, I think, contexts differ from country to country, and Singapore have been
Right,
tightening measures incrementally over the last couple of months or 2.5 months. So, and even now, it's not still a full lockdown, although it comes close to a full lockdown, but it's still not quite the case. And Singapore is a relatively small place compared to India, the size of some of its big cities or even smaller. So it's easy to do that. And uh, and I think Singapore has the experience of handling SARS from 2003 and 4, and therefore they know the drill. So I mean, I agree with you. The countries in general, with very few exceptions, have opted for full lockdowns, but full lockdowns of specific regions rather than the entire country And if you look at Japan and Sweden, they are still experimenting with different forms of lockdown, and so is probably the Netherlands. So you do have some standout countries which are practicing lockdown selectively, so that economic activity isn't fully shuttered. So I think it's not possible to compare countries in this situation. It may be feasible in some countries and not so feasible in some countries. So each one has to take a call based on their circumstances and based on their costs and benefits in the short, medium, and long term.
Right. Now, April 14 is less than a week away, and complete reversal of the shutdown looks unlikely. So, what are some 3 to 4 key suggestions that you would make for a calibrated exit
Obviously,
strategy?
we probably could think of letting private transport and then maybe even selectively air transport with a lot of restrictions on the maximum seat capacity that would be permitted to be filled, etc. And continue to focus on pockets of the country which are vulnerable and also the segments of the population that are vulnerable. Continue to advocate social distancing for sure, and at the same time, keep in mind the need for the need for movement of essential goods across borders in the country, and therefore, what is said at the top must percolate down to the local police constable, so that the movement of essential personnel and essential items, for example, uh, some of the farmers say that gunny bags are not allowed to be moved, and you can't harvest the rabi crop if you don't have gunny bags. And then for the harvesting, if you don't have people, the harvester, the mechanized harvester has to be allowed to move from state to state, so that farmers can get hold of the harvesters. And that is also not happening uniformly and evenly across different states. So these are all just examples to show that one needs to take a calibrated call to be able to allow private manufacturing to commence with private transport modes, etc. With all the precautions to be taken, temperature checks, symptoms, and exhorting people that even if they have the slightest suspicion that they should stay back home, and also to tell employers not to be very cost conscious. But more importantly, while telling employers to be cost conscious, we also need to provide them the support for them to be able to retain the workforce, etc. So I think, and also empower the states and local administrations to take calls, because this has to become a tailor-made approach rather than a blanket approach post April 14th.
Also, sir, one of the things, of course, with the situation now, a lot of things are going to be influenced, affected, changed. Some are more visible now, some not so much. And I think one of the main things that's coming up is obviously globalization. You can even hear it in sort of US press conferences and in other places where you can sense that there is now going to be a change in that area. And we've already seen some backlash there. We might move to a world which is where countries are more protectionist. There will be more restriction of the movement of goods and services. Now, in that sort of a scenario, what do you think the should be the kind of the growth model that India should pivot
No, I
to?
think you are absolutely right. I think the world will probably be more interested in reshoring, especially critical goods, including medicines, medical equipment, etc. And I wouldn't call it protectionism, because the norm itself will be changing. Something is protectionism only if the norm is so-called free movement of goods. And in any case, we should know that free movement of goods and services was not accompanied by free movement of labor, even before when we had globalization, because countries were still restricting free movement of labor. So it was not as though all factors of production and all finished goods were allowed to be moved across borders without any restriction. So whatever was convenient was touted as the norm. Whatever was beneficial for developed countries was sort of thrust down the throats of developing countries as a norm. And now the developed countries themselves are going to change the norm. Therefore, if the norm itself is going to be more produced as much as possible inside your borders and less outside, then the question of what is protectionism and what is globalization will itself undergo definitional change. So I wouldn't call it protectionism. I would just call it a natural and logical reaction to the realities of globalization, of outsourcing and offshoring of production. So that is my answer to the first part of your remarks. The second part is about India's growth strategy. Yes, of course. clearly a thrust on export growth to the exclusion of other avenues of growth will not be advisable at this stage because, first of all, global growth is going to be lower, and therefore import demand for India's goods and services will be lower compared to the pre-COVID days. That is one reason. And second, as you correctly pointed out, I think countries are going to focus on reshoring of production. And the third is obviously India doesn't have infinite resources to be able to devote to all areas of the economy, so it has to choose. And probably in these circumstances, based on the first 2 points I made about weaker growth and greater emphasis on reshoring, um, probably export sectors will have to relatively, I'm saying in a relative sense, get a lower priority than, let's say, construction, public health systems, healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, medical equipment, production of medicines inside the country, or even digitization of education, permitting more institutions to offer online education, and also in the process empowering higher education rather than keeping it highly regulated, etc. Uh, and domestic manufacturing for so make in India for India. These are all the strategies that the government of India needs to pursue. I'm not saying exports will not matter because India is a current account deficit country. India needs its hard currencies from overseas. It has to become specific sectors where we have the maximum bang for the buck. But between domestic growth revival areas and exports, the relative priority, I emphasize the relative priority, will, at least for the next 2 years, will have to be on domestic oriented sectors.
Also, finally, we've already had some announcements in terms of relief measures for the most poor and vulnerable in the country, and the government has also brought itself some time to work on other stimulus packages. What are some two to three other such packages that you would suggest the government roll out? Like, for instance, in the case of SMEs.
I think the important thing is for most SMEs is about the cash flow, and especially cash flow for payment of salaries and wages, and also deferment of statutory dues. The government indeed has said that for the next 3 years it would pay the uh, uh, EPF for the next 1 year. I think the EPF contributions for workers earning less than 15,000 rupees salary per month in establishments that have 100 or fewer workers. But there are other enterprises which employ more than 100 workers, but they also need the support, and they may not. The government may not want to pay EPF contributions on their behalf, but it could give them moratorium. I mean, we do see that labor commissioners in different states are sending very dire warning notices to enterprises, establishments, uh, not to delay, not to pay their PF contributions, etc. That's all right in one at one level because employees do need the money, but employers also need the money. And not all employers are cash rich. Even large enterprises are looking for working capital because their source of income also have dried up. So I think in this situation, one needs to take a broader view of who's hurting and who's not hurting, and instead of looking at it purely from a sort of a income distribution perspective, I think all affected sectors and enterprises must be provided cash. In some cases, it could be a grant. In most other cases, it could be a credit facility for payment of salaries and wages. And second, of course, the working capital needs, because companies and establishments have produced goods and sent them overseas, and those clients are not accepting them. And going forward in the future also, because those foreign enterprise buyers will be taking delivery later and making payments later, so working capital challenge rather has become much more acute for enterprises. So these two areas are important. And the third one will, of course, be to ensure that, as I discussed earlier, with the Rabi crop harvesting season coming up in the second half of this month, and then a couple of months down the road or three, you have the sowing season. So we need to be sure that enough equipment and movement of labor is allowed for agriculture to proceed without much of a setback. Otherwise, you will face food inflation risks and also misery for farmers. The fourth area I would say would be to choose sectors that are widely going to be affected. We have already a lot of reports from different agencies showing which sectors, like transportation, hotels, restaurants, and transport, logistics, etc., which are high intensive exposure to human contact and mobility, they are affected. And I think some kind of support packages, if not necessarily outright grants, but concessional credit facilities must be offered to those sectors. So these would form the main plans of an economic support package from the government.
Great. Thank you so much for taking time out and talking to us.
You're welcome. Thank you.